Hyperborea is often mentioned in historical Greek sources. It is a region beyond the north wind or Boreas, a perfect place where the sun shone 24 hours a day. The trees were very fruitful, so they produced fruit twice a year. Like the Scandinavians, the legend of Ultima Thule, the capital of Hyperborea, preserves a wonderful country in the far north where the sun never set and where the ancestors of the Aryan race lived, tall, blonde and blue-eyed people who ate only vegetable products. The Hyperboreans were very spiritually and technologically advanced. They piloted Hyperborea aircraft that can now be likened to UFOs. These flying discs used levitation, which was obtained by generating a strong magnetic field by two discs rotating at high speed in opposite directions, using the Earth's magnetic field to move. Scandinavian legend also mentions that Hyperborea disappeared during an ice age, and to save its inhabitants they dug huge tunnels in the Earth's crust with the help of large machines where they created together with the survivors of Atlantis an underground empire called Agartha, and the capital it was called Shambhala. In this video I will talk about Hyperborea, where it was located, who were the inhabitants of this territory, what is the connection between the inhabitants of Hyperborea and the aliens, as well as our country Romania and the legendary city of Troy. The information presented below is taken exclusively from the book Forgotten Genesis written by Peter Moon and Radu Sinamar. As mentioned in other videos, the information in this book was obtained by Radu Sinamar by viewing images from the distant past of the planet through a quantum device belonging to the inhabitants of the underground city of Apollos, located under the Apuseni Mountains, Romania. The city of Apollos and its inhabitants are in the fourth dimension and are more spiritually and technologically evolved than we humans on the surface who live in the third dimension of consciousness. The inhabitants of this underground city are already collaborating with certain institutions in our country, and in the near future the existence of the city will be made public. So the information presented in the Forgotten Book of Genesis, both about Hyperborea and other important moments in the planet's past, is a fact and not a hypothesis. Let's see below, briefly presented the true story of Hyperborea as it is presented in the book Forgotten Genesis written by Radu Sinamar, the connection of the Hyperboreans with the aliens, with our country and with the city of Troy. About 100,000 years ago, a devastating conflict broke out on Earth between several advanced extraterrestrial civilizations, members of the Galactic Alliance, who were carrying out genetic projects for the evolution of human beings on our planet. The source of the misunderstandings was the reptilian aliens, who then managed to transmit elements of their own DNA to the human population. All warring parties were aliens and were vying for territory or power of influence. In the period between 90,000 and 72,000 BC, there were other battles and tensions on the surface of the planet that also involved human beings. All those conflicts culminated in a terrible war on the territory of today's Europe about 50,000 BC. At that time, there was an advanced civilization of human beings on Earth called Tarsus. The configuration of the land in the northern hemisphere was a little different from what we know today. Sweden, Norway, and Finland were united with Europe, and instead of the large surface that is now covered by the sea there were only lakes and a few large rivers. The Tarsus civilization occupied these territories and even advanced further south, to Poland, Ukraine, Romania, and even slightly to the east, capturing some of the Baltic countries today. The vast majority of them were human beings, but they had a much slimmer, more vital, and more harmonious body than that of contemporary man. At the beginning of their civilization, 70,000 BC, they were beings, but the repeated combination with beings, there underwent major transformations, with strong accents From a certain point of view they were a civilization of demigods, or hybrids from the combination of beings with beings. The cause of the huge conflict around 50,000 BC was the friction between the different beliefs shared by the Tarsus peoples. At that time, the connections between the physical and the etheric plane of Earth were numerous, creating many gateways from one plane to another on the surface of the planet, but especially providing access to the sacred realms inhabited by wise beings in the realm of Shambhala. Over time, some groups of Tarsus populations began to want an expansion of their territory, which also involved several crossing zones between the physical and the etheric plane. Thus arose the first armed conflicts, which at first were relatively minor. Through their multitude and insistence, those battles and wars destabilized the natural existence of the interdimensional portals between the physical and the etheric planes. The etheric zones corresponding to those frequencies began to separate more and more from the physical plane, and this gave rise to great discontent and misunderstanding, as many possibilities were lost which were previously valid due to coexistence with the etheric plane, higher knowledge, much greater access, easy to move from one area to another, contacting higher beings and higher states of existence and others. Thus, each group of people involved in the conflict wanted an acceptable area to continue their existence, and many of them even wanted the Shambhala territories. That was in fact the moment when the Great War broke out, through a kind of union of all the outbreaks of battle that had been going on for many years in different areas of Tarsus. It was a terrible, huge, and devastating war. A huge army, led by factions hostile to the good, forced some entrances into Shambhala, attacking through several access areas, located in southern and central Poland. There they encountered a strong defense of the common areas of passage between the physical plane and the etheric plane. The conflict zone then spread to huge territories, as if in small fans, comprising part of Ukraine and northern Romania, the whole territory of Poland, going as far as the southern part of Sweden, inclusive. The terrible conflict involved a huge number of warriors, several million. The Tarsus were elite warriors, very powerful and with weapons that borrowed some characteristics and powers specific to the etheric plan, with which until then they had very frequent contact. In the war, along with the Tarsi, there were also less developed but very powerful groups of ENK beings, but with conventional weapons such as axes, spears or bows. It seems that even the smallest ENL beings did not stand aside from that terrible confrontation, using far superior technologies, such as some highly armed attack aircraft. They emitted a kind of jet like a bundle of lasers, which branched off near the surface of the earth and caused immense damage, both material and human. The conflict was so violent that after its cessation, some peace activists among ENL beings decided that it should be engraved in the memory of mankind, to prevent such a thing from happening again. In the conflict zone, in the etheric plane, some gigantic columns appeared like warning transmitters. They contained telepathic wave emitters inside whose purpose was to prevent any future such a devastating conflict by emitting specific frequencies that were activated in the event of such a threat. After the end of the war, the few remaining beings, especially the upper ones in the ENL branch and those in the upper ENK branch, that is, some of the demigods who represented hybridizations with ENL beings, later developed a high spirituality in that area, which thus became the birthplace of the great Hyperborean civilization. According to the forgotten book of Genesis, Hyperborea encompassed a vast territory, like a somewhat vertical strip of land from today's Transylvania up to what we know to be western Ukraine today, also capturing a small part of the western Baltic countries. A significant part of the territory was on the present-day surface of Poland, rising as far south as Sweden. It seems that there were two great periods in the history of Hyperborea, before the Great Tarsus War, which was between 70,000 and 50,000 BC, and after the Tarsus War 50,000 years ago BC. It seems that after the terrible confrontation, that territory, on which Hyperborea would later settle, remained almost uninhabited for a long time. Later the population in that area began to grow and individualize, becoming an independent civilization, a kind of administration in which the ENL beings who were leaders. Due to the high spiritual level they had managed to unite all the tendencies of the population in a strong civilization and a common spiritual orientation, especially because in the distant past of mankind the leadership was eminently spiritual. It seems that at that time there was no other type of leadership, because the administrative leader of a larger territory was at the same time a priest, and this fact gave an extraordinary strength to the population and guided it in a positive way. The new Hyperborean population was united and consistent in aspiration and thought, much like the Christian countries of medieval Europe were under the spiritual authority of the Pope. Some of the ancient Tarsus, who were originally ENL beings, but also combinations of ENL and ENK in the form of demigods, following numerous combinations with ENK beings became the majority ENK, being known as good craftsmen, especially by combat weapons. They defended the southern part of Hyperborea, living mainly on the territory of today's Transylvania and further north, to Ukraine. Then, about 27,000 years ago, the ENL gene had evolved so much that it had reached about the same level as that of advanced extraterrestrial civilizations. When that balance was reached, an understanding was created between humans, the ENL branch, and certain extraterrestrial civilizations, so that some of their high souls would incarnate in the bodies of ENL beings. At that time the ancient territory of Tarsus, which had become practically the territory called Hyperborea, was inhabited by many types of populations. In that vast territory were found almost all types of populations, whites, blacks, yellows, Mongols, and even other types, which were derived from them, but were still distinguished by certain features, skin color, eye color, hair, peculiarities of face or body. Sometimes quite different from what we know today. They endured because of the ease with which many souls on other planets incarnated on Earth and had physical bodies of ENL beings, because they could sustain evolved extraterrestrial consciousness. It seems that this was the last period of relative harmony on Earth, before the withdrawal of the ENL gene, which had depleted its resources. The withdrawal of the ENL branch was quite slow at first. It began around 27,000 BC and made ENL beings no longer spread all over the planet, but gradually remained only in certain areas of it. However, the withdrawal of ENL beings from the physical plane accelerated much after the sinking of Atlantis, about 13,500 years ago. The Earth remaining populated almost exclusively with beings from the ENK branch and possibly some ENL beings hybridized with ENK beings and only at the level of leaders. Or great leaders. ENL beings could be found, such as the pharaohs of ancient Egypt or the great kings of the Middle East. Since about 25,000 BC, temperatures on the planet's surface have begun to drop, causing ENL beings who already had a great resonance with the etheric plane to remain more and more in this subtle plane and have connections increasingly reduced to the physical plane. According to the forgotten book of Genesis, the Hyperborean civilization, in its active state, continued until about 14,000 BC, after which it became extinct. Small parts of it continued to exist in some areas of the former Hyperborea, even further north, but they formed very small communities. The rest of the population migrated quite quickly, especially to Atlantis and also to the south, to Transylvania, where they settled in the mountains. From there, after a few millennia, a part of the population descended to the south of the continent, giving birth in time to other great civilizations, closer to our days. Another part, however, migrated east to Asia in distinct stages, also laying the foundations of great civilizations. Another group of people, descendants of the Hyperboreans, left the area of Transylvania, together with their domestic animals, especially sheep, and settled on the territory of today's Turkey. There they initially built a fortress that in time became a large city, very well developed and even equipped with a certain technology, the fortress being illuminated during the night. The name of the city was Troy and it was built around a spatio-temporal discontinuity that allowed the connection with the high areas of the etheric plane and especially with Shambhala. The city was perfectly circular and surrounded the central point where the distortion was, the chasm through which it entered the etheric plane that corresponded to that area, but not all people had access to the upper dimension of the etheric plane. It seems that the descendants of the Hyperboreans, who founded Troy, even if they were only pale reflections of what was once Hyperborean civilization, still had enough secrets and even occult methods to resist the attacks of other peoples. We also learn from the book that Troy was the last city in Europe to maintain a strong connection with the subtle etheric plane. It was the last city through which the subtle etheric plane could be penetrated naturally and on a large scale. With the defeat suffered during the long war with the Greeks, the city suddenly broke from the physical plane, and then the reality on the surface of the earth was somehow soiled, because even the last stronghold of what was still superior, pure, and good was eliminated. Another interesting thing we find in the book is that the crossing zone in the etheric plane, inside the city, was the main goal of the Trojan War, in fact of the occult forces that suggested and directed it, using human beings as vehicles to achieve that massive energy rupture. After that, Troy resurfaced in the etheric plane, and the city as such could no longer be found in the physical plane. It also appears that what Heinrich Schliemann discovered in 1870 in the area of Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey today is only a small part of the city, more precisely that part that resonated closer to the physical plane. However, it does not represent the city of Troy, as archaeologists hasten to announce at the time. From Genesis Forgotten, chapter about the Great War Tarsus and Ed about Hyperborea, we can deduce the following. That mysterious Agathyrsi who lived in Transylvania, archaeological findings and local legends confirm their existence in this part of the country, are actually descendants these ancient people called Tarsi. So the Transylvanian Agathyrsi are the descendants of the ancient Tarsus and Hyperboreans.